The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We've been following what I have generally characterized as a definitive and decided war on free press by the Trump administration. And this has multiple components, and none of these should come as a surprise to you, because I've been talking about these over time. The idea of the media as the enemy of the American people. Pat having trouble today. I can't imagine why. Journalism licenses being required to practice media. Libel lawsuits made easier. We had, of course, countless tweets from Donald Trump about this, including the following tweet. The fake news media, failing New York Times, NBC News, ABC, CBS, CNN, is not my enemy. It is the enemy of the American people. And last week during a Jim Acosta and Sarah Huckabee Sanders, it's being described as an exchange. I call it more of a kerfuffle, I think maybe.
Tirade?
A tirade of sorts. The White House refused to deny that the press was the enemy of the American people. And in fact, I would argue Sarah Huckabee Sanders sort of confirmed it by saying, Trump has already told us what his position is on that, and I speak on the behalf of the president. And we now have a new poll to sort of add to our fleshing out of whether this is a strategy that's working. 43%, not 4.3%, not 14.3%, not 24.3%, 43%, nearly half of Republicans believe that Donald Trump should be able to unilaterally just say, this media outlet, it's over, whatever the you're fired equivalent is that you would say to a media outlet when they're going away. 48% of Republicans in the same poll agree that the media is the enemy of the American people. And this is where you have to understand the, I don't want to call it brilliance, but the power of these campaigns by Trump, where even without saying straight up, all media is the enemy of the American people, or media in principle are the enemies of the American people, half of Republicans are believing it. And Trump didn't even have to say it in as explicit terms as he could have. Now, in comparison, 12% of Democrats and 21% of independents agree about President Trump closing down media outlets. Those numbers are still higher than I would like to see, right? Like the number should be, if anyone who understands America is asked, should the president be able to say, you are off the air? The answer should always be no. We have systems in place. We have limits as to what can legally be reported. If you're FCC bound because of your broadcast platforms, there are rules governing. The answer should never be yes, the president should get to say you're off the air. Whether it's 12% for Dems, 21 for independents, or 43 for Republicans, it's all horrible.
Yeah, I'd like to see it at 0%. Of course, we'll never get that. Maybe just a few percentage points I would take, because this is the American public after all.
Someone
but it should
will
be very,
always,
very low.
Yeah, it's hard to get 0% of Americans agreeing on anything, right? I mean, let me put it a different way. It's hard to get 100% of Americans agreeing on anything. Overall, 57% of respondents believe that media is necessary to keep the Trump administration honest. I would agree with that. 13% of Americans agreed that President Trump should close down mainstream news outlets like CNN, The Washington Post, and The New York Times. What I go to is, number one, there's a partisan element, right? Like if a Democrat were president right now, you would probably see Democrats to a slightly higher degree saying Obama should get to close down whatever, and Republicans lower. But it's not just hypocrisy. There is no question that the so-called constitutional conservatives who claim to be all about the Bill of Rights and separation of powers and checks and balances and all this stuff, they seem completely unconcerned with the fact that there is nothing in the First Amendment which would allow for a president to just say this media outlet doesn't get to continue or that media outlet doesn't get to continue. And part of what has been going on that predates the Trump administration that fuels this is a distrust of media in general, right? In addition to the likely partisan divide that there is, in general, you have a high distrust of media. And I often am asked about this, right? People will say to me, David, if you're so often critical of media outlets, how are you now worried about the fact that Trump is criticizing media? What you have to understand is there's a difference between identifying a particular media outlet that's doing bad reporting and criticizing them. That's one thing. Versus me saying the president should get to pick which media outlets exist. These are completely unrelated problems that we're dealing with. And unfortunately, a lot of people are going in the wrong direction on this. 72% of respondents believe it should be easier to sue reporters willingly publishing false information. Remember, the keyword is easier. There's already laws that prevent reporters or punish reporters from publishing willingly false information. And it's working, and it's being reflected by Trump's own followers. Here's one example where CNN's reporter Jim Acosta was just yelled at and badgered during a Trump rally in Florida recently. So there are a number of disturbing angles to this. Generally, number one, the authoritarian tendencies. Shutting down media, lack of press freedom, right? We see this in places like Venezuela. We've seen it in China, North Korea. Turkey doesn't like the internet. We heard from President Erdogan that he's increasingly against the internet every day. When you see leaders wanting to have this level of control, that is an authoritarian tendency. And worse, when you've got half of one party saying you want them to have that control, that is really, really scary. Beyond that, I already mentioned there's the constitutional angle here. What exceptions are there to freedom of the press that would allow a president to close down a media outlet? But in the end, it's just more hypocrisy than it is anything else. The principles don't matter. There's a contingent out there. And it is the Alex Jones story brought a lot of them out, right? When it's Alex Jones being taken off of YouTube, YouTube is unjustifiably censoring Alex Jones, which isn't the government, by the way. But then all of a sudden, Republicans are asked, would you want the president, meaning the government, to just be able to select media outlets to shut down? And half of them say yes. It doesn't square. There's no way where both of those views can be held simultaneously without huge cognitive dissonance.
And I think we all see what Trump is doing here. I don't think he would actively pursue shutting down media outlets, and he wouldn't say anything to that effect. But he calls the media fake news, and he builds this distrust among his supporters so that they then fill in the blanks and reason that it's important for us to shut down these outlets.
Trump's goal is to not have to shut down the media outlets to make them completely ineffective. If you turn public opinion against them enough, if you frame them as the enemies of the American people and simultaneously spread so much and misinformation that people don't know what to believe, you won't need to shut down any of the media outlets because they won't be functioning as intended to begin with. We have a very, very interesting story involving a leaked audio tape. There's this really popular topic of conversation now, which is whether or not collusion is a crime. And this relates to Trump-Russia, in case you weren't aware. When we talk about is collusion a crime, it's not relating to, I don't know, it specifically is because of the Trump-Russia investigation that's going on. Despite denying that collusion is a crime, Trump regularly calls for Hillary Clinton to be investigated for colluding with Russia. So it seems Trump, on some level, must know that collusion can be criminal. Yesterday, we had a really great piece from an LA Times article pointing out that the Trump-Russia meeting in and of itself can be criminal. Trump has claimed that it's, quote, totally legal in a tweet over the weekend, but the meeting itself also can be criminal. But now we have something potentially even more interesting. Remember that guy, Devin Nunes? He's the Republican member of the House who for a while was running the House investigation into Trump-Russia. But then we found out he was secretly going to the White House to tell Trump exactly what it was that the investigation was doing. not something that is morally acceptable, ethically acceptable. And apparently that was what pushed him over the edge, and he was no longer running that investigation.
Yeah, and then he hinted that he was going to recuse himself, but continued running the investigation. It was all very weird, and lo and behold, the House Intelligence Committee didn't find any evidence of Trump-Russia collusion, and that's over now.
Shocking that they said case closed even after talking to missing key interviews with witnesses, but they said we didn't find any wrongdoing. So anyway, Devin Nunes, there are secret recordings which Rachel Maddow obtained where Devin Nunes is explaining to donors at a fundraiser about 10 days ago that actually, yeah, collusion can be a criminal act. This is straight from the horse's mouth, right? The guy who was there running the probe in the House until he had to leave because he was compromised, saying collusion can be criminal. The leaked audio came from the progressive group Fuse Washington, who turned it over to the Rachel Maddow show. Take a listen to this.
Now, if somebody thinks that my campaign or Kathy's campaign is colluding with the Chinese, or you name the country, hey, it could happen. It would be a very bad thing if Kathy was getting secrets from the Portuguese, let's say, just because I'm Portuguese, but rather. So Kathy was getting secret information from the Portuguese. May or may not be illegal, but ultimately, if that said the Portuguese came and brought her some stolen email, she decided to release those. Okay, now we have a crime, right? If somebody stole the email, maybe Kathy released it. Well, if that's the case, then that's criminal.
So let's explore what is Devin Nunes saying here and what isn't Devin Nunes saying. Nunes is not saying what Trump did is criminal. Okay, that's not what Devin Nunes is caught on tape saying here. What Devin Nunes is saying is the blanket statement that collusion isn't illegal is flat out wrong. Trump keeps repeating it. Trump's attorney repeats it. Other Republicans have been repeating it. Collusion is not a crime. Here is Devin Nunes behind closed doors saying something completely non-controversial for most of us, but it's not something you usually hear from the right, which is actually collusion can be criminal. Now, when confronted with this audio, of course they will say what Nunes meant is if Trump had gotten the dirt on Hillary, and if that dirt on Hillary had been illegally obtained, and if Trump released or used the dirt on Hillary, then and only then might it be illegal. But of course, that's a distraction because we already heard yesterday from two legal experts in that LA Times piece who explained the intent to conspiracy to defraud, the intent to conspire to defraud, I think better said, is a crime regardless of the outcome of the attempt. If you agree to meet with Russia for the purposes of receiving something of value, dirt on Hillary, to help you win an election, you've received things of value from a foreign country, you have conspired with them to defraud one of the fundamental government agencies of the United States, the Federal Elections Committee, which is there to run fair elections free from foreign influence. Even if you don't get the dirt, even if you get the dirt but you don't use the dirt, the intent that you had there already is the crime. So it's not hugely surprising that lots of talking points around Trump-Russia from the Republicans are lies. They seem to know that they are publicly saying things that aren't true. And from this same leaked tape, by the way, it's also interesting that Nunes seems really afraid of what happens to Republicans and what happens to Trump if they lose the House in November. He seems genuinely panicked, and he should, because he's part of the problem that should be investigated. And if the Dems do take over the House and Senate, and then they can start subpoenaing some of these documents that Republicans haven't been willing to turn over, they can take control of some of the committees that should be doing some of these investigations. So a lot of what's going on right now, Nunes knows you need to keep a Republican House and Senate to protect yourself. If they lose it, a lot of this stuff changes, and that's why people have to vote in November.
And you may find this surprising, but it looks like Devin Nunes is pretty safe in his district. He has a Democratic challenger. I think his name's Andrew Johns. And apparently back in June, Nunes was 8 points up. So who knows? It is California. It is like the Fresno area, which is pretty conservative. It could flip. But as of now, it looks like Nunes is pretty safe there.
Yeah, and of course, it's not about him personally, but it's about those 68 Republican-held seats where the Democrat currently is in better shape than, what's his name, O'Connor was in Ohio's 12th district special election earlier this week. So Nunes is panicked, and Republicans should be, but only if we actually go out and vote. Send me your thoughts. I'm on Twitter at @DPakman. We will take a quick break and be back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Let's do some thank yous. Why not? I'm feeling generous today. Damon Lewis is today's new member of the day. Damon, thank you for being a member. We're mostly funded by members like Damon Lewis. We also want to say thanks to folks who have been with us for a while. And Brock Heaton has been a member dating all the way back to 2013. March 12, 2013. It is a day that, for me, is a major, major milestone for the David Pakman Show because it was the day that Brock became a member. And every March 12th, we celebrate Brock's ongoing and longer membership. So thanks to Damon and Brock. Join membership by going to www.joinpakman.com. You can also support our work if you value it. You don't have to, but if you like what we do, you can support it on Patreon at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Okay, as many of you know, we have a discussion forum that exists on Reddit for the David Pakman Show. We have nearly 7,000 viewers and listeners participating there. You can find it at davidpakman.com/Reddit. That's REDDIT. I want to go through some interesting posts and discussions from the subreddit, including, is the Alex Jones issue about free speech or antitrust? I find this very interesting because I brought this up when we were talking about the Alex Jones controversy. The free speech issue is not actually an issue when it comes to the government's limitation of free speech. It's not a First Amendment issue. We can talk colloquially about whether YouTube is de facto or in practice censoring by saying we don't have to take Alex Jones' channel. But the argument for me that is a stronger one than a free, if you're going to make it a free speech issue, you have to talk about the antitrust issue, because how do you make this a free speech issue? If you can successfully argue, and there's legal precedent for this, I think it's a 1966 Supreme Court case, which says certain entities, if they get so big and contain such market share that they become sort of indistinguishable from an official government entity or actor, all of a sudden, government, they have to be or can be regulated as if they were governmental institutions. Now, whether it would apply to speech, if you're YouTube and you're determined to be that big, it would have to all be legislated. But the point is, if you're really arguing that the problem is because of YouTube's size, it becomes a free speech issue, isn't it really an issue about having a system where companies can get this big in the first place?
Yeah, that's a fair case to make. But certainly, I think libertarians and folks on the right in general wouldn't be the ones to make it in most cases. Like, they're not the ones to argue against, or to argue for antitrust laws.
No, they're not.
But it would help them in this case, that's for sure.
Yeah, and I think that this is something that we really should be talking more about, because it's part of all this is that Spotify, iTunes, etc., the reason we need to think about them differently, it's not just a small business saying, listen, we don't have to do business with everybody as long as we're not violating non-discrimination laws. Their case is that these are so big that it's different. Well, maybe we should look at how they got so big in the first place. And you're right, Pat, a lot of them don't want to do that. Also from the David Pakman Show subreddit, what people mean when they say free market healthcare. And this is a great post that was put together by one of our Redditors who lists all of the ways in which we already don't have free market healthcare, right? People like to say the system we have is a free market system where health insurance companies can offer plans. If those plans are good enough at the price they are charging, they will get customers, and otherwise the company will naturally go out of business, or they will have to either improve the coverage or reduce the price. The problem is, as this poster points out, we subsidize and tweak the free market status of healthcare all the time. Everything from public education for those who become doctors, public funding of colleges to create doctors in the first place, subsidizing the costs of new hospitals for-profit healthcare and hospital companies. It's a very long list, and of course it's a very good point, which is that we like to talk about, or some like to talk about, this industry is a free market, that industry is a free market. And very often it ignores all the ways in which it's not actually a free market, but we seem to be okay with those in principle, or at least we don't see anybody arguing to change those. And with a lot of these provisions, tax deductions for medical research, which lets the government pay for all private medical research, that's a modification to the free market. It's not a totally free market. And to argue that what we should have is a free market healthcare system would require getting rid of all of this stuff that we already have. And there's not much appetite that I see to do that from the left or the right. Also from the David Pakman Show subreddit, this is kind of funny. We've been putting up on social media, on Instagram, on Twitter. Producer Max has been finding nuggets of wisdom from the show and converting them to text form and posting them online as quotes of mine. And unfortunately, that has now been perverted or subjugated because someone took one of those quote graphics and put what I think is a quote from Donald Trump. The quote that's being attributed to me is, "Yeah, that's her with the gold. I better use some Tic Tacs just in case I start kissing her." You know, I'm automatically attracted to beautiful. I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet. Just kiss. I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything. Grab them by the pussy. You can do anything. That is not something I ever said on this program or anywhere. This is a quote from Donald Trump, but it's now being spread around the internet as something that I've said. And I am here to tell you today, it's just not something I've ever said.
I think it sounds pretty presidential. I wouldn't be too worried about it if I were you.
I could get if it weren't for the fact that I wasn't born in the United States, I feel like this is a quote that could get me elected president.
It's not going to hold you back. You could still go on to achieve great things.
It certainly won't limit me. Join the discussion. It's not all fake quotes of me. There's actually really good discussions that happen on the subreddit. You can find it at davidpakman.com/REDDIT. Earlier this week, 3 Russian journalists were murdered while investigating a private Russian security company in the Central African Republic, a country in Africa, for those who aren't familiar. Kirill Rodchenko, Alexander Restorguyev, and Orkan Zamal were all laid to rest in Moscow earlier this week. They were going to spend 2 weeks in the Central African Republic. They were investigating a Russian security company named the Wagner Group, which has interests in diamond and gold and uranium mines and CAR, and it's also considered Putin's private army. The leader of Wagner is currently under U.S. sanctions for aiding Russia-backed rebels in Ukraine. Not surprising, given everything we know about the intertwined nature of Russian oligarchs. And in February, the Wagner Group was also involved in a 4-hour attack against American commandos stationed inside of Syria. Now, if you know anything about Putin, and we know some things about Putin, you know that investigating anything that's nicknamed Putin's army is probably going to be a little bit dangerous for you, and it was for these 3 journalists because they were ambushed. Their driver somehow survived. That's part of the question around exactly what went down. The driver said they were ambushed by 10 men who spoke Arabic and were wearing turbans, as the story goes. And again, the driver got away completely unharmed, which is question number 1 about what exactly went on here. And as you research the story, you find out that the organization funding these journalists was the Investigations Management Center, which is bankrolled by an anti-Putin Russian oligarch. Or in other words, the paychecks for these journalists came from someone who is anti-Putin in Russia. The journalists were on their way to meet with someone who had promised to provide access to officials who could speak on the record about Russian involvement in the Central African Republic. And of course, they never made it to that meeting. And these deaths immediately become suspicious. They become appended to this very long and growing list of suspicious deaths among Russian dissidents and opposition journalists. And of course, the Putin defenders are saying, listen, guys, Central African Republic is dangerous. For all we know, the driver sold them out. Since after all, the driver did survive, there's nothing to see here at all, except that we have, of course, example after example after example of Wagner-related, quote, accidents that happened to Russians. There's one example from April, a Russian journalist who was investigating Wagner in Syria, fell out of his 5th-floor apartment. Not the most common accident that people have at home, not exactly stubbing your toe with that coffee table. And then, of course, we could do an hour just on suspicious dissident and journalist deaths related to Russia. But on Wednesday, the U.S. issued sanctions against Russia for that chemical weapon use to kill former Russian agent Sergei Skripal on British soil, which we covered extensively. So I've said it before. I've said it many times. To figure out a story, you sometimes have to look at the micro and you sometimes have to look at the macro. Oftentimes what conspiracy theorists do to trick people into believing their conspiracy or to distort stories is they will focus on the wrong one. On a story where you should be focusing on the micro, they will focus on the macro, or vice versa. We can never be 100% sure that these three journalists died for their anti-Putin work, or because they were maybe suspected of already having something on Vladimir Putin. That's another possibility. But it fits into the broader pattern of these deaths, right? You have a bunch of cases where people who are hostile to the Putin regime, they're investigating the Putin government, they're doing this type of work, they die in unusual circumstances, poisonings, vehicle ambushes in foreign countries, falling out of high windows, accidentally stabbing themselves 10 times in the back. Okay, maybe that last one I made up, but it's sort of the prototype of these situations. So yeah, the Central African Republic is dangerous for anyone who is not from there, and even for people who are from there. Anyone could fall out of a window. All of that stuff is possible, but here it's the pattern that's difficult to justify as a coincidence. And as far as the CAR is a dangerous and remote place, it has nothing to do with Putin. Well, listen, if they're willing to poison someone on British soil, why wouldn't they be willing to do something even more noticeable like a car ambush in the Central African Republic? And this is the authoritarianism that Trump is impressed with time and again. When it's Duterte from the Philippines, when it's Putin, when it's Erdogan, when it's Xi Jinping, whoever, Trump is impressed with these types of authoritarian tendencies. These are the guys Trump really likes. And it is yet another, not one, but three Russian journalists doing work hostile to Putin, maybe already had stuff on Putin, who end up in an unfortunate wrong place, wrong time situation. I guess that's what it's being called, if you believe that. If you believe that. Send me your thoughts. This is something already being discussed on the David Pakman Show subreddit at davidpakman.com/REDDIT. We will take a break. We have a great interview coming up next, more stories, the bonus show, a lot going on today, and I'm glad you're with us.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to be joined today by James Fallows, who's a national correspondent for The Atlantic and co-author with his wife Deborah Fallows of Our Towns, a 100,000-mile journey into the heart of America. It's so great to talk to you, James, and the book is fascinating. You went all over the country, 25 cities, I believe, flying to most or all of them in a single-engine plane, which you piloted. Talk to us a little bit about the sort of objective of the project.
The objective was essentially just to see the U.S., and there was a particular predicate for it, which is that from 2006, really until 2011, Deb and I were living in China and reporting for The Atlantic, and Deb was writing a book called Dreaming in Chinese. And what we had tried to do there, even while being based both in the first Shanghai for a couple of years and then Beijing, was essentially to spend all of our time on the road and going to every little province and on ox carts, literally, and trains and buses and riverboats. So we thought we came back to the U.S. and back to our home in D.C. It'd be worth trying to do some of the same reporting in the U.S. And we had for a long time flown around this little propeller plane, a Cirrus SR-22 with a parachute for the whole plane. And we knew there were lots of places you could get to that way. You couldn't get to very easily by interstates or by commercial airlines. So we just thought, let's see what kind of there is there. If we want to spend time in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, or in Duluth, Minnesota, or in Columbus, Mississippi. And so this ended up going on for more than 4 years. And we sort of, each step we took, we learned new things.
I think that it's quite common that there are people in the U.S. who, assuming that you're sort of in the income bracket where you can afford to do some travel, who will often end up becoming more familiar with other parts of the world than the parts of their own country that maybe aren't as accessible to them. I know that only in recent years have I started to go to places like I was in rural northern Indiana a few months ago. I've been to Ohio. I've been to some other places that wouldn't sort of be natural vacation spots. Did you find that, or do you find that this is a pretty common phenomena, that many traveling Americans know foreign countries better than they know the different corners of the U.S.?
I think that's a great point. And so a homely example of that will be that over the last 40 years now, my wife and I have lived essentially half of our time in D.C. And it's always true that people who are visiting D.C. go out and see museums and restaurants and new attractions that if you're living in the place, you don't get around to seeing. And I'm sure that's true of any big town. I think it's also the case that again, Americans who are in the traveling class, when you're in the U.S., it's remarkable that the, say, dozen hub airports, Denver, Atlanta, O'Hare, San Francisco, Seattle, et cetera, get something like 80% of all the commercial traffic, because that's how things are concentrated in various ways. And people, their air travel takes them to places that look familiar. And when you think of exploring the world, it might be places from Tuscany to, if you're adventuresome, Singapore or Southeast Asia or Australia or maybe Africa, more than South Dakota, more than Missouri, more than Mississippi. And so that was part of our wanting to remedy that imbalance too.
One of the things I was struck by about 6, 8 months ago when I went to rural northern Indiana, this was sort of my first trip to a really red area after the election of Donald Trump, other than maybe some parts of the Florida panhandle, was that even though I had kind of like an on paper understanding of how and why it is that people in some of these parts of the country voted so overwhelmingly for Donald Trump, I still was passing a certain degree of judgment on it. And after spending some time living in visiting northern rural Indiana, I realized that, of course, they voted for Donald Trump once I understood that in a lot of these places, the only meeting point is the mega evangelical church, as an example. Of course, that's how they ended up voting. And it really shifted my perspective about just how different the day-to-day lives are of people in different parts of the country. Do you have any anecdotes that resonates with?
Yes, and our complementary, with an E rather than I view to that is a different kind of both explanation and puzzle for the results in the 2016 election. Most of the places we ended up spending time were in states that went for Donald Trump. If you're the Plain states, and we were in both Allentown and Erie, Pennsylvania, and the South, South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana. And it was, on the one hand, you would think these places would not be expressing outrage of the kind that was normally diagnosed after the election, in that most places the economy was slowly improving. Most places, believe it or not, were being quite inclusive of immigrants. For example, in western Kansas, the population is now mainly Latino. In Betsy DeVos's hometown of Holland, Michigan, that also is majority Latino now. There's lots of other indications I could give you of something resembling a healthy American civic fabric. And yet, when it comes to talking about national politics, there was this really polarized, extreme, bitter, resentment-driven feeling, which was embodied, among other places, in some of these mega churches. So you could have in Dodge City a place that went very heavily for Donald Trump, but their city finance manager, who's very popular there, is a man named Ernesto de la Rosa, who's there on a DACA waiver. And their school district is majority Latino, and they're voting bond issues to keep it going. So something in this disconnect between the increasingly tribal and resentment-driven national politics, which made people think, yes, Trump is against our enemies, and we really hate Hillary Clinton because she's crooked. They would vote that way nationally, and the texture of local life was different from that.
Can you talk a little bit about, are there examples that you might have for, our audience is mostly a progressive audience, although they're not just in cities on the coast, they're really spread out throughout the United States. But we've heard this theme that if you don't understand rural America, you don't understand why Trump won. What are some of the specifics that maybe aren't understood about rural America?
So I think there's one. So I should say as background that both my wife and I, although we've, I worked for the Atlantic forever and we're part of, quote, the national media, unquote, we are from originally small inland towns and felt as if this was our territory. I'm from a little place called Redlands in California, excuse me, which is right next to San Bernardino. It's very different from coastal California. Deb is from a manufacturing town in Ohio, Vermilion, Ohio, which is west of Cleveland. So we felt as if these were places familiar from our upbringing, though not our current life. One, I think, understandable point of resentment is less the familiar one of economic dislocation, which of course is real, or the opioids disaster, which is of course a disaster and becoming a nationwide one. It's what I think of as two-dimensionality versus three-dimensionality, which is when there are media or movie or print magazine or newspaper discussions of Boston or of DC or of San Francisco or of other big centers, the tone tends to be a sort of richly three-dimensional portrayal of people's motives and the complexities there and people's agency and the ways they're trying to respond to their environments. I think there is an awareness by most of the interior of America of being presented two-dimensionally, that media people will go there and go to a diner and find somebody with a Trump hat and say, are you still angry? Do you still like Trump? And just presenting people as victims and objects and as being significant mainly as sort of background players in the national political drama. And I think that most people in any part of the U.S., any part of the world where I've lived, they like to think of themselves as the central characters in their own lives. And they have their own independent drama, and they're making things better and worse, and they have agency and they have choice and all the rest. So I think that is one. I'll give you one illustration of that. There's a piece in a leading website that I won't name right now that was tracing this Russian spy who was recently arrested, the young woman Russian spy. When she went out to South Dakota, the Russian spy was sort of allying with the NRA there. And the piece was framed as here we are in a lightly populated state, most familiar as the home of Mount Rushmore. This was talking about the city of Sioux Falls, which actually we spent a long time in. It's a very leading tech city, Sioux Falls. They have lots of precision agriculture that comes from there. And so I think the people in Sioux Falls would think, what the hell? We're being portrayed as kind of these bit players in a national media caricature of what life is like away from Brooklyn or DC. So I think that an awareness of being presented as one-dimensional or two-dimensional figures rather than fully fleshed out figures is an underappreciated point.
I'm curious as far as your method of transportation, your single-engine propeller plane with a parachute. Were there at any point during this trip situations with the plane that did not go as planned, close calls, emergencies, or was that not a dramatic part of the trip in any way?
We tried to minimize the drama. This was the extension to the flying world of the no drama Obama policy. We wanted to, I have an instrument rating. I've done this for a long time, but we wanted to fly in good weather. But there's always something unexpected in small planes. So we ended up spending an unexpected day in Murray, Kentucky, home of Murray State University, when some spark plug suddenly failed. We were over the desert of Arizona when suddenly all navigation info just was blotted out in the plane. The GPS system just went entirely down. We were minorly reassured when we heard on the air traffic control, Albuquerque Center, this is United 404. We've lost all our guidance. The Air Force was testing an entire jamming of the GPS system upon use. They hadn't let us know about this in advance. But
perfect.
So we had surprises, but no emergencies.
Well, the book is fascinating. It's called Our Towns, a 100,000-mile journey into the heart of America. The book has two authors, James Fallows, who's been speaking with us, as well as his wife, Deborah Fallows, and I encourage you to check out the book. And James, I really appreciate you talking to me today.
David, I'm very grateful to your interest and that of your audience. So thank you.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We talked about this kerfuffle between Saudi Arabia and Canada that started when a Canadian official called out Saudi Arabia on Twitter for their human rights record, understandably, and the oppression of dissidents and journalists. And specifically, Canada was calling for the release of jailed women's rights activists. And Saudi Arabia immediately pushed back against Canada's human rights record. And you might say, what human rights record of Canada's was there to push back against? And we've now learned that as Saudi Arabia was doing this, as Saudi Arabia was criticizing Canada for their human rights records, they crucified a man at Mecca for theft and murder. First of all, what would Saudi Arabia criticize about Canada? It's kind of a weird thing. It's a weird combination of things. Number one, Saudi Arabia criticized the arrest in Canada of a Holocaust denier named Ernst Zundel, who was convicted of spreading false news in the harm of public interest. Saudi Arabia felt that that was a violation of human rights. Saudi Arabia criticized Canada because Jordan Peterson something. It was like some people don't like Jordan Peterson and what Jordan Peterson says, even though Peterson's never been arrested. That was part of the Saudi critique of the Canadian human rights record.
That happened?
Jordan Peterson is a prisoner of conscience, I think they said. Saudi Arabia says, I mean, it's almost like I'm reading an Onion article. Saudi Arabia says that Canada has a high rate of persecution of women. Hardly true about Canada, but very true about Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia also, in the middle of all this, put a picture on social media of a plane crashing into buildings in Toronto, sort of reminiscent of the 9/11 attacks carried out, of course, mostly by Saudi individuals. But then when the public was appalled by that, they republished the picture sans the plane. The plane had been removed from the picture. So the criticisms by Saudi Arabia of Canada make no sense whatsoever. But meanwhile, they crucified a guy as part of a state-sanctioned capital punishment death penalty incident that is regularly carried out by this extremist Muslim theocracy. A man in Saudi Arabia was accused of serious crimes. No one's denying that. Breaking into a woman's home, shooting and stabbing her, which killed her. Really, really horrific crime. And the country decided that the punishment for this man would be crucifixion, which is when you publicly hang the body after the execution has taken place. Backwards, totally Dark Ages practice. And what we need to be doing immediately is getting away from fossil fuels altogether, because then Saudi Arabia's alliance with the United States becomes increasingly irrelevant, partially. So there's this immoral alliance that I've pointed out for a decade at this point with Saudi Arabia. And our continued sale of more and more weapons to Saudi Arabia is part of it. Our shared goal of Middle East stability, mostly based on oil, is a big factor. If you stop using oil, you stop needing oil, and you can get away from the Saudi Arabian alliance. However, it's now a lot more complex because we make money off of Saudi Arabia. Military industrial complex companies make money selling Saudi Arabia weapons. Defense contractors make money doing business with Saudi Arabia. So now it's much more intertwined than oil. But this is like the last country that we should be having an alliance with.
Yeah, one would think that we would have more of an alignment with Canada on this because it's about human rights.
Yeah.
But the Trump administration is staying silent on this.
Yes.
Meanwhile, we're ramping up the tariffs on Canada, yet there are no sanctions on Saudi Arabia, and we just gave them a $110 billion arms deal. So
yeah.
It's all messed up.
So Saudi Arabia is epically hypocritical by saying that Canada's human rights are a problem. But then all the countries that do business with Saudi Arabia, like the United States, but claim to care about human rights, are also huge hypocrites. And this may well lead to Canada cutting ties with Saudi Arabia, which I would love to see, because those ties are a disaster. And as a quick reminder, to kind of like paint the broader picture for you here, Saudi Arabia is a member of the United Nations Human Rights Council. They crucify people as part of state-sanctioned death penalty proceedings. I cannot imagine something more ridiculous and immoral. So we've been experiencing somewhat of a controversy around the David Pakman Show taking live calls. For a long time, we didn't take live calls at all because we didn't have the technology for it. We ultimately obtained the technology to take live calls in a way where people could get in a call queue and we could bring people on one after the other. And it's a pretty controversial segment on the show. A lot of people love live calls. Others hate live calls. I've had people cancel memberships because they hate live calls so much. I've had people join because they think it's so great that we hear from the audience via the live calls segment. So this has been a pretty major rift among the audience. And then, of course, a lot of people said live calls. I've never heard those. And that's the case with any one segment, which is not everybody is aware of every single segment that we do. So lately, the live calls have definitely been better. I think there's a couple things that we're doing. Number one, in both the video that publishes on YouTube that says we're about to take calls, and now when you call the number, it also says this. We have messages to people saying, have your question ready and ideally written down, no speakerphone, be at your phone, listen for your area code, be prepared to get right into your question. That has improved the calls. To some degree, I think that I have smoothed out some ways of interrupting the callers that filibuster and give me 5 minutes of background, and it's not even clear they have a question, and if they do, by the time they're done with their 5 minutes, they often have forgotten it. I think I'm being a little better about interjecting there and not letting that become a disaster.
Yeah, there definitely has been an improvement overall, but we still get those rambling preludes. We still get people who want to ask 6 or 7 questions.
Sure.
And they can only get to 1. But
yeah.
I think we're headed in the right direction.
I think we are, but we still decided to put it up to an audience vote. We initially had sort of an informal survey done of the audience, and then we said, listen, you can vote via Patreon, where if you make any contribution ending in .01, like $1.01, $2.01, whatever, that's a vote for live calls. If you make any contribution ending in .02, so like if you donate $1.02 or $3.02, that's a signal that you are against live calls. And what I am here to announce to you today is that we are going to be keeping live calls. But we've also considered people's comments about limiting them. So more people want the live calls to remain than the number of people who want live calls to go. But we've heard the people that say you should not do a ton of live calls every single week. So there's a few ways we can do that. One thing is we keep it to only once a week, and it's all only on the Friday show, right? Yeah. So if you want to avoid that, you can easily avoid that. Another possibility, right, and this is something we could think about, we'd have to think about the logistics, is that we take like just 6 minutes of live calls every single day. So instead of a voicemail at the end of the show, we take out the voicemail and we take out one story and we combine that and we can do like 3 2-minute live calls or something like that. Yeah. The upside is people will get more stories on the Friday show. Maybe they like that. The downside is if you don't like live calls, there would be a little bit of live calls every day. So I'm open to changing that. Right now, the plan is we will continue with live calls on Friday, sort of overlapping or alternating that with a classic interview, which people do seem to like unless they hate it and skip over it, which some people do. And we've heard the voice of the audience, which is keep the calls, one, but consider limiting them, improving them, and condensing them within sections of the program.
Yeah, I mean, doing the live calls every day would kind of be in keeping with other talk shows, because there are many other talk shows that do that.
Right.
We just don't know if that's the right fit for our show. And for now, we'll probably just limit it to the once-a-week thing. Yeah,
I think that for now, that's how it's going to stay. But I am open. I'm at your service, okay? This seems to be the simplest thing. Just do what we're doing. Keep them within a segment or two just on the Friday show. If people like the live calls, they're very easy to find. If people don't like the live calls, it's very easy to skip them. But this is something that you can send suggestions and ask me questions about on Instagram. The show is now on Instagram at David Pakman Show. And earlier this week, we did a Ask Me Whatever You Want segment on Instagram where people could type in their questions and then I would type a response and then it would publish it. And a lot of questions and suggestions there about formatting issues related to the show. So if you're not following the show on Instagram yet at David Pakman Show, please do it. And because it's one of our newer platforms, you have more direct. If you ask a question on Instagram because it's new, it's almost guaranteed it's going to be answered versus live calls where we have 12 to 15 people holding by the time we're done because it's become so popular. If you want a direct line to the show, right now, Instagram is it, until, of course, it fills up with Pat's fans and stuff like that. And then we would, have a harder time getting to everybody's questions.
I used to reach out to you directly, or so I thought directly, by YouTube comments.
Sure.
And I learned quickly enough that that was not the best way to do it.
Right. You realized you were moderating the comments you were leaving and that they weren't actually getting to me in many ways. And then, you know, Pat, his brain almost exploded when he came to that realization. Okay, we have a voicemail number. That number is 2192-DAVID-P. What are we talking about today? It's been a weird day here. We got a voicemail, and that voicemail is about Jordan Peterson. And it's been a while. I know the audience. There's a contingent of the audience that loves Jordan Peterson stuff. And then there's the bulk of the audience which despises Jordan Peterson stuff. They just don't care about him. They don't care about what he says. They don't care about what the audience says about what he says. It's been weeks and weeks. And I did get a question about Jordan Peterson. Take a listen.
Hey, David, why does it seem like now that there are so many young men that seem to be lost in society now and don't seem to know what to do or what their place is in this world?
Right.
And why is it that they all seem to be gravitating towards Jordan Peterson as their, I guess, messiah or leader or person to look up to?
Yeah.
What is it about now that makes this a huge thing?
Yep. Very good question. Here's what's going on. Feeling lost in the world, an existential crisis, a midlife crisis, a quarter life crisis, whatever, right? These are not uncommon occurrences. The ideal thing would be, my prescription for that would be, you work with an actual mental health professional in a clinical setting. I know people will say, well, Peterson's a psychologist. Okay, that's fine. But people that are consuming his pop stuff, his tours and stuff, that they're not having a relationship with a mental health professional the way I'm thinking of in terms of psychotherapy. You would go and you would find a good therapist that is not, that works in a way that you're comfortable with, and you would explore what you're experiencing in that way. You might read nonfiction about the world, right? I think that it's often a really great thing, and it can be life-changing to go and get books about science and the history of the universe and philosophy and history and geography, right? Inform yourself about all of the things that go on in the world and how the world came to be the way it is, in combination with maybe working with a mental health professional. And of course, some people are feeling that way because they may have some kind of underlying psychiatric condition. And in those cases, medication may be appropriate there in some of those cases. The next step that a lot of people would go to would be pop self-help, okay? The reason that Peterson is getting a bunch of these young men that are going to him is because they either don't want to or don't have the resources sometimes to go the first route, which is to spend time learning about the world and maybe in a talk therapy situation. But they see the normal pop self-help stuff as kind of sissy for them, right? It wouldn't feel right to a lot of them to go to just like normal, the self-help section at your local bookstore and to pick up some it would feel not manly, and it would feel very sissy.
So they want that self-help perspective, but wrapped up in some sort of machismo, and that's what they get from Jordan Peterson?
That is exactly where Peterson comes in. You've got these men who don't feel as though, or aren't in a position to, go route number one that I mentioned. They wouldn't really feel good about themselves if they did the standard pop self-help stuff. So what Jordan Peterson has packaged up for them is really unremarkable, pretty standard self-help ideas. They've been repackaged into language that feels better for a lot of these young men. The persona that's been built around Peterson is of this truth teller who's not going to kowtow to political correctness and using pronouns that he doesn't think are the right pronouns to use. So it's just like it's marketing. What it is marketing. And that's why these individuals are going towards Jordan Peterson rather than towards all sorts of other options that they could go to. And it's at a particularly interesting time because with the advancement of modern technology and social media, and we know how people interacting with these platforms and content can be affected in ways that aren't particularly positive, you also have arguably a resurgence of people who are sort of like in the market for the type of thing Peterson is offering. So that's what it is. And I'm open to having my mind changed, as some people like to say.
You don't think that Peterson's advice is insightful? Like, I sit up straight now. I have much better posture. I clean my room every day. It's changed my life for the better.
Here's the thing. I don't want to laugh it off because for a lot of people, hearing that type of thing is actually useful. there's nothing uniquely insightful or useful about getting it from Peterson other than maybe feeling better about the packaging and the marketing that's sort of around it.
Yeah.
It's been repackaged, yeah. We've got a great bonus show for you today. I'm out of time because I spent so much time responding to that voicemail, but the bonus show is great. Membership is great. Patreon is great, and I'll talk to you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.